A new police chief walks into his precinct undercover, hoping to observe his officers without their masks. But when a white officer spits in his face, thinking he's a nobody, the entire room is just moments away from a shocking revelation. Stay with us until the end. This story is too inspiring to miss. Before we start, let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. For months earlier, the sharp night wind swept through the streets of Chicago, carrying the metallic scent of rain about to fall. Richard Nelson, a cop hardened by recent events, sat inside his car, parked in front of a modest house on the city's south side. The engine was off, the lights dimmed. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if that alone could contain the storm raging inside him. The house was small but well cared for. The front yard displayed flowers that someone clearly took the time to water. But what held Richard's gaze wasn't the flowers or the warm light spilling from the window. It was the 10-year-old boy sitting on the porch, his skin the same deep brown as Richard's. He stared at the ground, clutching a toy car in his hands. The boy was Malik, and that house that was Richard's mother's house. He should go inside. He should climb the steps, hug the boy, and tell him everything would be all right. But he knew that would be a lie. There were no guarantees of safety anymore, not after what had happened. 3 days ago, Malik lost his father, lost him to a badge, and the memories of that night burned inside Richard. It was supposed to be just another patrol. Richard drove slowly through the streets of Chicago, his veteran partner, Gerald Mason, in the passenger seat. They'd worked together for years. Richard, meticulous and by the book, Mason, rougher, more impatient. But somehow, they had always balanced each other out. The radio crackled. A possible home invasion. Black male suspect, approximately 35 years old. Richard pressed the gas, heading toward the call. When they arrived, the scene was already unfolding. A dark-skinned man stood on the front lawn of his own house, hands raised, trying to explain himself to 2 officers with their weapons drawn. "This is a mistake. This is my house," the man pleaded, his voice shaking with desperation. Richard recognized that face before he even stepped out of the car. It was his brother-in-law. "Michael?" Richard rushed forward, but Mason was already moving. "Stand down! I know this man," Richard shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the deafening sound of a gunshot. The world seemed to freeze. Michael collapsed, eyes wide with shock. His body trembled, chest rising and falling frantically as blood spread across the concrete. Richard dropped to his knees, pressing against the wound, but he knew it was too late. Mason stood there, gun still smoking in his hand. He tried to run. "I thought," Mason stammered, but Richard could barely hear him. The badge on Mason's chest gleamed like a branding iron, burning into Richard's soul. The weight of the truth crushed him. The very system he had sworn to uphold had taken the life of an innocent man. And worse, if he hadn't been there, he might have never known the truth. The case was buried. The reports were rewritten. Mason was placed on leave, but not punished. That was when Richard knew. If he wanted justice, if he wanted change, he couldn't just stand by and watch. He needed to get inside the system itself. He needed to become the authority that demanded respect and fairness. 3 months later, when he received an offer to become the chief of police in Blue Ridge, he knew this was his chance. Now, standing outside his mother's house, watching Malik clutch a toy car, a gift his father would never give him again, Richard made a silent promise. He would bring change to Blue Ridge, even if he had to walk through hell to do it. Then came the day. It was a humid Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car in Blue Ridge, a small town in North Carolina. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt and worn-out jeans, he didn't look like a man with 2 decades in law enforcement. That was exactly his plan. As a black man taking over a department plagued by whispers of misconduct, Richard wanted to see things for what they truly were, without filters. He scanned the precinct's parking lot, catching snippets of small talk and the occasional curious glance. No one recognized him. His appointment had been announced just days ago, and his arrival was kept quiet. Adjusting his baseball cap, he took a deep breath. The weight of his mission pressed heavy on his shoulders. Slipping through a side entrance, Richard moved unnoticed among the officers, who were busy chatting or sifting through paperwork. The fluorescent lights reflected off the tiled floors, and the air was thick with the stale scent of old coffee. As he paused near the break room, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you!" Richard turned to see a white officer striding toward him with a smug grin. The name on his badge read Daniels. Behind him, a few other officers leaned against the wall, watching the exchange unfold. "You lost or something? This ain't a shelter," Daniels sneered. "Take that mess somewhere else." Richard hesitated, debating whether to reveal himself or let the moment play out. Daniels stepped closer, his voice rising. "You deaf? I said get out. We don't need your kind around here." Laughter erupted from the others. Before Richard could respond, Daniels leaned in and spat directly in his face. Time stood still. Warm saliva dripped down Richard's cheek as the laughter echoed around him. One officer doubled over, wheezing with amusement. Another murmured something about putting people in their place. Calmly, Richard pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice steady. Daniel smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." Without another word, Richard turned and walked toward the main office. A voice crackled over the loudspeaker, calling all personnel to the briefing room. It was time. The room buzzed with conversation as the officers gathered. Daniels leaned against the wall, still grinning. At the front, Captain Harris cleared his throat, calling for attention. "Settle down. We have an important introduction today." The officers fell silent, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Daniels remained oblivious. As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today, we welcome his replacement, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department. Richard stepped forward. The room went still as he walked up to the podium, setting a folder with the department's seal onto the lectern. Slowly, he scanned the room. Daniel's smirk faded. Recognition dawned, draining the color from his face. "Good morning," Richard began. "My name is Richard Nelson, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." Silence deepened. Daniels flushed as murmurs rippled through the room. Richard continued, his voice steady. "When I arrived this morning, I came dressed like an ordinary man to see this department through an unfiltered lens. What I witnessed was eye-opening." He raised a hand, quieting the whispers. "In my short time here, I've already seen behaviors that aren't just unprofessional, but completely unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. "Respect is not optional," Richard declared. "It is the foundation of law enforcement. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the community we serve." He let the silence hang, watching as officers shifted in their seats. "This morning, some of you laughed, thinking you were watching just another powerless man being put in his place. But let me remind you, everyone who walks through these doors deserves respect, badge or not." His words sliced through the tension like a blade. "Officer Daniels." Richard stepped down from the podium, closing the distance between them. Daniels instinctively took a step back, his gaze faltering. "You represent everything that is broken in this department," Richard continued. "When you spit in my face, you didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected the badge, the oath, and the community we swore to protect." Daniel stammered. "See, Chief, I didn't know." "That's the problem," Richard cut him off. "You didn't care to know. You assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter." Turning to the rest of the room, Richard stated firmly, "What I witnessed today wasn't just a failure of one man. It was a culture, and that culture ends now." Returning to the podium, his voice lifted slightly, emphasizing his next words. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended, pending an internal investigation. And for those who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is the first of many changes." Sighs rippled through the room. Daniels clenched his jaw, avoiding the stares of his colleagues. "This isn't about punishment," Richard stated, his tone unwavering. "It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to meet it, this is not the place for you." With one last look around the room, he concluded, "If you're ready to grow, to be better, we'll move forward together. But know this, I will hold you accountable every step of the way." The meeting ended in silence. Officers filed out, their usual chatter gone. Daniel stormed off, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. Back in his office, Richard sank into his chair, exhaling deeply. The real work was just beginning. Years of ingrained attitudes wouldn't change overnight. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to make friends. He came to make a difference. The phone rang. It was Captain Harris. "Chief, you handled that better than most would have." "Thank you, Captain," Richard replied. "But the real work starts now. I need a full review of Daniel's history, complaints, incident reports, everything on my desk by tomorrow." "You got it," Harris assured him, pausing before adding, "And Chief, I think you shook some of them up today, in a good way." In the weeks that followed, the precinct began to change. Daniel's suspension sent shockwaves through the department. Officers who once laughed at his behavior now avoided him. Richard made a point to walk the halls regularly, his presence a constant reminder of the new era. Some officers embraced the shift. Officer Renata, a young recruit, admitted she had stayed silent about the toxic culture out of fear. "I want to do better, Chief," she confessed. "That's all I ask," Richard replied. "It starts with you." Not everyone was willing to change. Daniels appealed his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. But Richard stood firm. A review uncovered a long history of previous complaints: excessive force, inappropriate comments, misconduct. His appeal was denied. Richard made it clear. The days of looking the other way were over. One morning, during a community event, a young boy approached Richard. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, wide-eyed. "I am," Richard answered with a smile. "My dad says cops don't care about us," the boy whispered. Crouching down, Richard met his gaze. "I can't change the past, but I promise, we're working to do better. If you ever need help, you come find me." "Okay." The boy nodded, a small smile breaking through. By the end of his first year, the precinct wasn't perfect, but it was different. Officers who refused to adapt were replaced with recruits who shared Richard's vision. Slowly, the community began to see signs of change, a renewed effort to build trust and bridge divides. One evening, Richard stood in the precinct hallway, watching officers clock out after their shifts. The laughter and camaraderie felt different now, genuine, inclusive. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth every fight. No matter our race, profession, background, or financial status, we are all equal in the eyes of God and under the law of men. May this story inspire us to create change, even if it's just in our own circles, just like Richard did. If each of us does our part, we can build a better world. And if you want to be part of this transformation, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. Oh, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one.